administration recognized that BITAC was out of bounds. And it was the Bush administration itself that ultimately repudiated the power grab contained in the memo. So that 2 years after BITAC was written, Bradbury of the Office of Legal Counsel retracted it and basically said, we no longer believe, we think this is a problem, we do not assert this level of constitutional power asserted in BITAC. So it's not just those on the far left who are saying this is out of control, it's people within the Bush administration itself who said shortly after this was leaked, and maybe that's the reason they walked away from it, but they recognized that this kind of power grab was inconsistent. And in fact, when you read some of the stories about some of the heroes of the Bush administration, and there were some, one of the things that jumps out at me is the people who were willing to say no. There's a famous story that's been documented in several sources about John Ashcroft, certainly not probably a hero for most of us, Attorney General Ashcroft. But in a hospital room, when people in the Bush administration were trying to force him to sign on to continued surveillance programs that he knew were unconstitutional, he refused from his hospital bed to do that. And there were competing groups within the administration, one group trying to get him to sign, the other group not. The group trying not to have him sign, rushing to the hospital to prevent the signature, to explain to him this was not right, included Comey from the Bush administration Justice Department. And Mr. Comey was somebody who came out of the office that I worked for, the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. And so there were people in the Bush administration. I think we have to recognize this. We have to realize this is not purely an ideological debate, that there were members of the administration who were willing to say no to the extreme views taken by a cadre of folks within the Office of Legal Counsel. And truly, it is this failure to be independent, this failure of folks like John Yoo, Jay Bybee, and ultimately Alberto Gonzalez, the failure of these folks to be independent, to stand up to the president, to be Mr. Yes Man, that ultimately caused, I think, the most devastating consequences to the Department of Justice, causing that department, which for years had had stature not only in this country but beyond, to lose stature for failing to stand up for basic constitutional rights. Now, I want to move for a moment beyond the mere legal question of torture, because I think it's clear under statute and under the Geneva Convention that torture is illegal. But I think it's important to note that torture is also wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. So that even when people, and academics love to do this, including academics like Alan Dershowitz at Harvard, they talk about the ticking time bomb scenario. What about the ticking time bomb? You think about the popular television show 24, where it's almost viewed as heroic to use torture to stop a mass tragedy. But there was a very famous and important law review article written a few years ago in the Columbia Law Review, where the position was taken, and I completely endorse this, that the prohibition on torture should be viewed as a legal archetype. It's iconic. It has force beyond the legal force. It has moral force that helps us as a nation retain standing on the world stage. And one of the criticisms made in this law review article by Professor Waldron was that the very exercise of the Office of Legal Counsel taking the definition and trying to torture the definition itself, to come as close to the line as we could, to say, well, putting an insect in a cave or putting an insect in a container is not torture, waterboarding is not torture. That very exercise of trying to come as close to the legal line as possible, I think they went over the line, but even if you believe that that was within the line, that exercise is in and of itself degrading of this iconic prohibition on torture. The prohibition on the use of torture shouldn't be something that we, as a society, say, well, let's see how close we can get to it without jumping over the line. It should stand as a line that we don't even want to get close to, because it ultimately deprives us of the humanitarian principles that we stand for. And so I think as a moral matter, I agree with Professor Waldron that yes, even if we had a ticking time bomb, we should say no to torture. But in the real world, that ticking time bomb scenario is never really what we have. And indeed, in the memoranda in which the OLC was endorsing the use of these coercive Japanese. They never limited their use to a ticking time bomb scenario. There was never a situation where it's been demonstrated that we used waterboarding and averted a catastrophic event. The CIA may have claimed that they were getting good information, but in the real world, and I'm someone who's participated in interrogations, in the real world, if you want to get good information, as the FBI has demonstrated for years, you do that through building rapport. You don't do that through torturing someone or causing pain. Someone who's suffering pain is going to tell you anything. They'll give you bad information just to make the pain go away. So, from a utilitarian perspective on torture, it often doesn't even work. Often the information you're going to get from it is junk information. And indeed, the most recent information that we have in terms of the documentation is that the information we got through waterboarding was information that we either A, already had when the interrogation methods were appropriately being done, or B, were false information that led the CIA on a number of wild goose chases. So the ticking time bomb scenario is very interesting from an academic, hypothetical perspective, but in the real world, that's never what you have. Instead, what you have is the possibility of getting a little piece of information that maybe you match up with another little piece of information that you're getting from somebody else. It's never going to be so clear that, oh, if we just torture this guy a little bit, he's going to be the key to unlocking the next great tragedy that could befall our nation. That's just not the way things work in the real world. But even if we concede, as I think we must, that sometimes, in some instances, torture has worked. There are demonstrated instances in Israel, for example, in the past, where sometimes torture worked. But guess what? The country of Israel, even recognizing that and dealing with much greater terrorist threats than we ever had to deal with, has taken a firm stand against torture. That country has said no to torture, despite the threats they face on a daily basis to their very existence. And I say today that unlike some people on the Supreme Court who say we should ignore foreign precedent, that we can learn from foreign precedent, and we can learn humanitarian values from other democracies in this world, and that we should look around and realize that far from being a leader, we have become someone that needs to follow the humanitarian goals of others. So I stand with you today strongly against torture, not only because it's illegal, but also because it's wrong, and also because it does nothing but hurt us in the long run. Thank you very much.